Bibles to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. And a day like today makes us appreciate salt, right? Rock salt. Maybe you threw some on your sidewalk. We put some out in the front parking area. We're glad they were spreading it on the roads today that enabled us to get here. And those of us from Kansas, we all know that a lot of the rock salt comes from out near Hutchinson. There's giant underground mines there. And anybody here been underground in the Hutchinson salt mines? There's one over there. There's a handful of you. Very good. I look forward to the day when I get to go and have that experience myself. Folks in Ohio understand that there's another place where they get salt. And it's kind of interesting because there's a salt mine under Lake Erie. Think about that. Now you're like, hey, that lake probably weighs a lot. It's the shallowest of the Great Lakes. It's maybe 300 feet deep. And right in downtown Cleveland, there's a big elevator that goes down a third of a mile and then extends out under the lake 4 miles. And they're mining rock salt under there. There's a huge deposit of salt that extends clear across Michigan and up into New York. And it's under the lake. Kind of a crazy thing. So while the city's going about its business, and I've been there and flown in and out and never had any idea that where this salt mine was or what it was doing. Sailboats are going back and forth. Way under the ground, there's this subterranean environment full of vitality and life. Lots going on to bring salt back up and keep the roads clear. Interesting, as I was reading that, I thought about how a lot of people look calm on the surface, but there's a subterranean world happening inside of them that they don't always let people in on. There's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of fear or guilt or regret or anxiety, some grief going on. And on the surface, they look like they have everything all figured out. But this subterranean vein of shame and guilt or regret. If people really knew, they wouldn't want me. If somebody finds out. And so this fear of exposure keeps them sealed up tight, posing to be somebody they're not. Our study series is called Deliverance, looking at the book of Exodus, and today we're going to chapter 2. We're studying God's deliverance of the Israelites, that bondage in slavery to Egypt. We're drawing parallels to our own bondage to sin, to bitterness, to fear, to our own limitations. The hope is, the great news is that God specializes in deliverance stories. Many here today could testify to God's capacity to bring deliverance. And He's writing yours even today. Now in Exodus 2, we come to Moses and his family background. Now for a lot of people, their family is a source of joy and peace, confidence and trust. But others come from more complicated and unsettling circumstances. They live with a subterranean sense of guilt or shame. Buried deep below that part that everybody sees is a background that they hope nobody really ever finds out. So I'm going to read Exodus chapter 2 and then look at the issues going on in Moses' life that he had to deal with that were subterranean, and then how God's hand of providence was in all of those circumstances. Chapter 2, verse 1. And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse your child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." What a fascinating story. So let's look at some of the issues and break them down that are going on in Moses' life. So first of all, we have the fact that he comes from a family of slaves. A family of slaves. Past, present, any thought of the future. It's all about the slaves here. And if you look to the past, his whole tribe of people, it's been 300 years of slavery. Have you ever noticed how you meet somebody and you say, "Well, hey, so what do you do?" So imagine it back then. "So what do you do?" "Make brick." "Hey, so do I." "What about your dad? What did he do?" "Make brick." "Yeah, so did my dad." "What about your grandfather? What did he do?" "Make brick." "So did my grandfather." "What's your son going to grow up to do?" "Make brick." For hundreds of years, there was no creativity. There was no initiative. There was no structure. Everything was completely planned out for them. The second half of the book of Exodus is God giving his rules, the 10 Commandments and other guidelines that the Israelites would be following. And as I was reading through there recently, it dawned on me, those were all necessary, because what had their cultural legacy been for the last 400 years? Slaves. They hadn't had to make a decision about anything for 400 years. God was laying out, here's the values and priorities that a society would need to have. They had no independence. This is just who we are. How many people have viewed their family background and said, "This is just who I am. This is who my dad is, so that's who I am. That's just how my family's been, and that's how I am." And so whether it's conflict or immorality or profanity or career or direction, whatever it is, that's just who we are. That's how my family's been. That's how I'm going to have to be. There's no separate identity. There's no distinctiveness. Notice in verse 1, his family was so generic, his parents aren't even named. We don't even learn their names until chapter 6 of Exodus. It just says there was a guy from this tribe who was married to a woman and they had a child. A second element taking place in formulating Moses' family background was what I would call a disappointing religion. A disappointing religion. These folks would have had the Jewish faith, and they would have been aware that God promised their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he would make a great nation of them. He promised that he had a promised land for them, and they would be his chosen people. And that through them all nations of the earth would be blessed. And they're slaves. Not for years, but for centuries. They're slaves. It would have entered somebody's mind that maybe, just maybe, God's not coming through on his promise. Think there were a few disappointed people? Wait a minute, I thought God had a promise for us, and this is what it's going to be? A subterranean disappointment that God didn't come through. You know, another one I think that could have possibly been playing with Moses' mind would have been survivor's guilt. What was the Pharaoh trying to do with all the baby boys? Trying to kill them. Several of them lived, but here's Moses. Why did I live and nobody else did? And then we're going to see he gets to a place of privilege at the royal household. How did I get here and nobody else did? He's one of the surviving babies. His mother puts him in that floating basket and puts him in the river, and he's found. He entered a world with cruelty and pain and slavery and despair. He was hidden for 3 months. Do you think it was fear or faith that motivated Moses' mother to put him in the basket? Fear or faith? Fear of Pharaoh. They didn't kill him or allow him to be killed. Or faith in God. Take a look at Hebrews chapter 11. There's a section in Hebrews 11, if you're taking notes. Hebrews 11, 23 through 28. We're going to refer to most all of those before we're done today. But verse 23. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw that he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's commands. It wasn't fear. It was great confidence that God was at work. Now, how did those people have that amount of faith in God after 300 years of slavery? Let me just say that to parents here a moment, whether you have fear or faith, that will be contagious. You will pass that on to the next generation. We could almost say that it's inherited. If you look out at the world and it's a big and scary place, and you better hang close, kids, and I'm not sure you're capable of handling it out there in that big and scary world. Guess how they'll begin to think? Guess what their mindset's going to be? But Moses' mother was communicating to her son from the earliest days. There is a God, and there is a purpose, and there is a plan, and there is a future, and there is a hope. And I don't care what's happened in the past, there is hope for a future. This isn't the end of the story. There's more to come. The attitude of the parents got passed on to the kids. They picked up on it. Well, number 4, we're going to throw this in the mix. Birth order. There's some folks have studied birth order. Kevin Lehman is one of those that has studied and written on that sort of thing. And Moses was the 3rd child. He was the baby, the end of the line, the caboose, whatever you want to say. He had an older sister, Miriam. She was 7 to 12 years older than him. He had a brother named Aaron that was 3 years older than him. And then he comes along. And so there's certain dynamics in play depending on what sequence kids are born in, and speaking in generalities. But that was a factor in Moses' development. A 5th one is that Moses got adopted. He got adopted into Pharaoh's family. And so it would be possible that there would be some questions. Where do I fit in? Where do I belong? In Hebrews 11, again, verse 24 and 25. Let's find that scripture. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. How fascinating that when he got old enough, he made his decision based on what he'd learned as a small child from his mom. The next verse goes on, verse 26. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than treasures in Egypt. He looked to that reward. His loyalty was to God, even in the face of disappointment and delayed promises. He looked to God. And that's where his loyalty was. Another dynamic in play was that he was raised in privilege. He was brought to Pharaoh's house, verse 10. He brought him to Pharaoh's daughter and he became her son. Acts chapter 7, there's a portion of scripture that talks about Moses. And in Acts 7, in verse 22, it's Stephen giving a sermon. Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and mighty in words and deeds. Fascinating that he was mighty in words and deeds, because in a few weeks we're going to look at the excuses Moses offered God when he was called at the burning bush. I can't speak, I got a stuttering problem, whatever. Not according to Stephen. What would have been involved in Moses' education if he was taught in all of the learning of Egypt? The best tutors, the best educators, languages, philosophy, the arts, the sciences. You think of the pyramids and statues and ancient artifacts. Egypt was a very advanced culture. Moses would have had some advanced teaching for sure. Centuries after Moses lived, Egypt built the most important library of its day, and maybe in history, the library at Alexandria. Alexandria was a port, and they built that library there. It held up to 400,000 scrolls. And so they would have been accumulating those. It would have been in their mindset and culture. And that's the environment Moses would have grown up in. One more, and I thought this was fascinating. He's given an Egyptian name. Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses because I drew him out of the water. Now, names, in the culture, and as we read the Bible, we see names are a big deal. God changed Abram's name from Abram to Abraham, and he changed Sarai to Sarah, and Isaac means laughter, and Jacob means supplanter or deceiver, and Joseph means he shall add. We hope God sends more children into our family. And you're no longer Cephas, I'm going to call you, you're no longer Simon, I'm going to call you Cephas, Jesus said, a stone. And so names mean things. At Christmas, we pointed out that Joseph, when he found out he was going to be the father of Jesus, and he was told what name to name him. He shall be called Jesus. And Joseph learned that when Jesus enters your life, that you're no longer the boss. He's the Lord. He's the boss. He calls the shots. And we take a back seat to that. So naming is a big deal. And Moses went through life constantly reminded of his Egyptian name. Now, some of those may have been detrimental factors. Some of those may have been positive factors. I list those 7 to say he had chatterbox voices in his head, filling his mind. I wonder what would be on your list. My parents divorced when I was such and such an age. My dad wasn't there. My mom was there. My mom wasn't there. My dad was there. We grew up in this kind of environment. This attitude was in our household. I wonder what the voices in your head are telling you from your list. You're not worthy. You deserve this. You don't deserve that. Don't let anyone find out. What is the subterranean experience of your life? And what is it you're trying to keep down under there? Hope nobody finds out. You'll be so ashamed. Your family history tells you where you've come from, but not where you're going. We're defined by a God who loves us and has a future and a hope. But far too many of us hear the voices bombarding us in our heads. You're not worthy. You're no good. This is just who you are. This is just part of what your family is. This is what your family does. Am I this or am I that? What I want us to see is that God's hand was on Moses through every one of those circumstances. See, I don't know what you'd put on your list. I don't know if you'd come up with 7 things. Some of you are like, man, I have more issues than a magazine, so put me down for 12. Put me down for 52. I don't know how many would be on your list. But I know this, Jeremiah 29 and verse 11 says, I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord. Thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. The things that you thought were there, that are all against you, they're all piled up, but you don't know what I've had to overcome. You don't know what I've had to deal with. You don't know what my life has been like. I probably don't. But I know there's a God who has a future and a hope for you. I know there's a God whose hand has been at work, taking some of those very things that have been problematic in your life, that are making the list. He's going to say, I've been at work the whole time. In Jeremiah 1 and verse 5, it's our memory verse for this week. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. I ordained you a prophet to the nations. God saying to Jeremiah, I had a plan and purpose in everything that's happened in your life, Jeremiah, from the earliest days. From the time you were in the womb, I had a plan for you. And we look at Moses' life, and we see the hand of providence in every circumstance. God has a plan and purpose. Let's look now at Moses' life from a different perspective. And what my hope is that you look at your background and you say, wait a minute, God was in it all along. God's plan and purpose was there the entire time. For one thing, he remained hidden for 3 months. How did they keep a newborn quiet for 3 months? Anybody ever lived next door to a newborn baby? You can kind of hear that kid, can't you? Crying now and then. You that have little ones, when you've had them, man, how do we keep this child quiet and such? God allowed that child to be hidden for 3 months. And then they put him in the river, and he got a river ride. Maybe Moses' mother knew where the Egyptian women came to bathe. Maybe he knew where the Pharaoh's daughter was going to be. Maybe she was hoping anybody would find him and have mercy on him. No matter, God orchestrated the event because somebody came and found him. The New King James translation describes the basket as an ark. Isn't that a fascinating word? Has God ever used an ark before to deliver anybody? I loved that choice of words in the translation. How about God's hand in the royal discovery? That the Pharaoh's daughter would be the one to find him? I was fascinated to note that at the end of verse 6, Pharaoh's daughter immediately recognizes this is a Hebrew baby. She knows the law. She knows the Pharaoh's edict. He's her father. She keeps the baby anyway. And then how about the right caregiver that comes along? Miriam, the older sister, had been watching from a distance, sees the baby discovered, runs up there, says, "Hey, how about if I go find somebody to take care of this child?" She goes and calls her mother, the mother of the baby. And not only does Moses' mother get to raise him, she gets paid for it. God's hand was in this. One more then, the regal access that he had in verse 10. He grew up around the palace. He had access to the learning of the Egyptians, leadership skills. He knew how the palace functioned. Now we have two lists for Moses' life. On one hand, we have a list of all the factors that could cause trouble, that would be chattering in his brain. And on the other side, we have a list that says, here's how God's hand has been at work. So let me ask you, of the two lists that you could potentially have in your mind, which one do you dwell on? Which one do you focus on? Here's how we tend to think. It's human nature to think about the negative list. You don't know what I've had to deal with. And I'm not worthy, and I don't fit in, and I don't belong, and here's my list right here. And we tend to ignore the side that would say, God has been at work in this entire time, and look how He's shaped and brought you to this point. And as we dwell on the negative list, and then things happen. Something comes along that is on the negative side of things, and here's what we say. Yep, see there? That's what I get. That's what I deserve. That's who I am. That's how I am. I'm always like that. I always mess up. I'm a loser. It doesn't fit. I can't fix anything. I don't work. That's just who I am. When something good happens that could be the hand of God, that could help us focus on the other side, the other column, we excuse that and we dismiss that as an exception. As good luck. Well, I guess lightning struck again. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. And we come up with those kinds of excuses to excuse it away. We dwell on the negative. I have no chance. The deck is stacked against me. The habits in our family, the lying and the fights and the drugs and the cheating and the alcohol and the pornography. You don't know what I've had to deal with. But we look at Moses' life and we say, God had His hand in every part of that. In fact, most of those issues are the very things God was going to use in Moses' life to help him overcome. So I want to offer a couple of overcoming conclusions as we look at these two lists in Moses' life and for us. The first one is this: God is calling you to be a change agent in your family tree. God is calling you to be a change agent in your family tree. His plan and purpose is to build in you a future and a hope, to build in you character and resolve, and use that to change the direction of your family. It was Bruce Wilkinson years ago at a Promise Keepers event in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he talked about breaking the transgenerational curse. I'll never forget it. Because he said there's so many of us are defined by what's happened from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. And it defines our family, and that's just who we are, and the deck stacked against us. And what choice do I have? I'm just like my family, my background. You don't know what I've had to deal with. For Moses, that few years with his mother built in him the faith so that when he was 40 years old and he looked out, he said, I do not identify with the Egyptians. I'm a Hebrew. I'm a follower of Jehovah. That's where I live. So let me make just a comment to parents here. We only get 18 years with our kids. 936 weeks, Lucas said a couple weeks ago. We have a very limited time. In fact, one of the comments in this Facebook is, we only have 52 weeks to parent your fifth grader. What a fascinating phrase. I remember several times as we were having some conflicts in our house. Hey, I've never parented a seventh grader before. Hey, I've never parented you in eighth grade before. I've never parented you in fourth grade before. You've never been in 12th grade before. We're all learning here every day in this process. Moses' mother, we later learned her name was Jochebed, had a very limited time with Moses. And the spiritual training that he would have received, that he had to have received, because he was brought up in the learning of the Egyptians. But when the time came, he made his decision. I'm going to identify with the Hebrews. So how long did Moses' mother have? How long would she have nursed him and raised him? 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? When Hannah brought Samuel to the temple to work with Eli, he was 4 or 5 years old. So she had limited time and she made the most of it. So what we're teaching our kids that we don't have forever. Now, and I know there are seasons of life that you think are never going to end. Are they ever going to sleep through the night? Are they ever going to get potty trained? Are they ever going to, pass a spelling test sort of thing? Is it ever going to get to the end? Are we ever going to have time alone together? You know how Dad and Mom are thinking. We have limited time. But he goes to the palace. He might have been related to the Pharaoh. You know, when he went back to Pharaoh to demand that God release them from slavery, that animated movie, The Prince of Egypt, portrays the Pharaoh and Moses as brothers. No doubt there was a relationship there. He would have known some of the people. He would have known how the palace worked. Did God have a hand in raising him as a Hebrew and then putting him in the palace and around the Pharaoh and the leadership environment? God was preparing Moses to be the change agent. God was calling Moses to break the transgenerational curse. And he's calling you to do the same. Second, no matter your upbringing, you are responsible for the choices you make. Looking back helps you understand how you got where you are, but it does not excuse where you are. And it doesn't excuse where you go from here. Moses had all of those factors going on, but he was still responsible, and you and I are too. There's not any excuse to go back and say, well, the place I grew up, or the family environment I had, or the family environment I didn't have. That's not our excuse to make. We're responsible. Third observation. God's hand has been on you, and he's bringing you to a place of victory. His hand has been on you. And whatever circumstances have been going on, God has wanted to work in your life and through you in those circumstances. Take a look at Romans 8 and verse 37. It says, yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. I don't see passive victims there for God's people. I see overcomers. I see people that face their issues and their problems and say, wait a minute, I have God on my side. God's hand is at work. And it may have been centuries of this kind of identity, but God is calling me to be the change agent. He's at work here. His purpose, His hand is here. He didn't call me to be passive. He called me to be an overcomer. A fourth observation drawn from Moses' life. God's purpose for you may not be realized yet. God's purpose for you may not be realized. Moses' life is easily segmented into 3 parts. 40 years, 40 years, and 40 years. The first 40 years, Moses spent growing up mostly around the palace. Charles Swindoll says it like this: the first 40 years of his life he spent thinking he was a somebody. The second 40 years of his life were in the wilderness, tending sheep and such. And Swindoll says the second 40 years were thinking he was a nobody. The third segment of his life is when he came back and set my people free, the plagues, and then leading them out into the wilderness, lifting his rod and the Red Sea parts, striking the rock and water comes out, speaking to God and manna comes down. And the third and final part of his life, learning what God can do with a nobody. The first 40 years, thinking he was somebody. The second 40, thinking he was a nobody. And finally, learning what God can do with a nobody. But what that segmented discussion tells us is that he spent 2/3 of his life preparing for God's plan and purpose. Anybody want to wait that long? Would anybody here get impatient with God if they had to wait 2/3 of their life? He was 80 years old when God's purpose for his life began to be realized. So 2 comments to that. 1 is let's be patient. And 2, let's be faithful while we're in the waiting. Be patient, because you might look out and you say, all I see is the negative column on my list. All I see is the bad stuff that's happened and what I'm up against. And I don't see any way this is going to turn out for good. And I don't see where God's hand has been at in this. Be patient. But then secondly, be faithful to God. To trust Him, to follow Him, to obey Him. We'll end on this one. The 5th one. Overcoming takes courage. It requires courage and boldness from God. Our 2 messages so far in our deliverance series from Exodus. Chapter 1, we saw the boldness of the midwives. The Pharaoh had said, you that are delivering babies, the Hebrew babies, you need to kill every baby boy, throw them in the river. And they stood up to him. And they looked him in the eye and they said, that's not happening. But then how about the courage of Moses' mother? Her name was Jochebed. She not only saved her little boy, she put him in the same river with the intent that he be found. She set him up to be discovered. What kind of guts did that take? And so many people look at their life circumstances and they say, woe is me and I'm not worthy and I'm just a victim and look what's happened to me. And if you had these things happen, you wouldn't, be able to do anything either. And we are just passive victims in life. I'm getting bullied and I got picked on and this happened and that happened and you don't know what's happened to me and you don't know how hard I've had it and this has come up and that's come up and this diagnosis. And we have a long list. What's on your list? And then we look at Moses and we say, God has orchestrated all of that to use you as a change agent. He's created us to be overcomers. We're more than conquerors through Him who loved us. He didn't intend for us to be defined by our past. He didn't intend for us to be defined by whatever you've put on that negative list. And He didn't intend for us to be haunted by the chatterbox that goes on in our brains, telling us how unworthy and shameful and sad and lonely and isolated and misunderstood we are. He intended for us to rise above and to use those as stepping stones on what He wants us to accomplish with our lives. You're not there yet? Be patient. He may not have yet revealed the purpose, but there is one. I know the plans I have for you. Plans to give you a future and a hope. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you and I sanctified you. I set you apart. And I had a purpose for your life. And God looks at you and He says, before I formed you, I knew you. I set you apart for a purpose. I long for you to find and discover God's purpose for your life. Would you bow your heads with me, please? With heads bowed and eyes closed, it's probable that many of us here have quite a list of what we've been through. Nothing that we've talked about in Moses' life did he cause, did he ask for. And a lot of you have had to go through life dealing with stuff you just didn't ask for, you didn't sign up for. And it wasn't fair and it wasn't kind. And you've been whining and wallowing and feeling sorry for yourself, hosting pity party after pity party. How about today if we say, God, I'm going to begin looking for how your hand is at work in my life. God, I will start looking for where you're at in my life. God, I wonder how you're going to use this pain. I wonder how you're going to use this illness. I wonder how you're going to use this brokenness in my life. To bring some new freedom, not only to me, but to someone else. God, I wonder how you're going to use me to break the transgenerational curse. This sin will not happen in my family anymore. This passivity will not happen in my family anymore. What do you need to say to God today? What responsibility for your life do you need to start taking? What have you been excusing because you focused on that other list? God in heaven, so many of us need to learn from Moses. He could have focused on all of those things that were stacked against him. All of those factors. And so many of us here today have. You call us to be more than conquerors. You call us to rise above. You call us to be change agents. You have a future and a hope. And how I pray that each of us leave with a new resolve to seek the power of God and to look for the hand of God as you write a new deliverance story. In Jesus' name, amen.